They say you have to know the past to understand the present. Now, imagine traveling back in time with me to explore archaeoastronomy, where we discover how our ancestors first studied the stars. Our journey takes us not only through space, but also time, helping us feel closer to those people from long ago who, just like us, loved looking up at the night sky. In this episode, we'll be dipping our toes into a variety of intriguing topics such as Indigenous Science, star system, physics, energy lines, and much more. Today we are joined by Dr. Paula as a guest on this episode. She has a passion and knowledge about such topics, and we are going to explore them through our conversation. She's an Indigenous Science researcher specializing in decolonizing methodologies and traditional knowledge with a PhD in Recovery of Indigenous Mind. So, stay tuned to explore the incredible ties between the earth, the sky, and ourselves. So, hello everyone. Welcome to another episode of Maps and Metaphors. Today we are with Dr. Paula. So, welcome to this episode.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So, could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yes, my name is Dr. Paula Macdhubhsidhe. My anglicized name is MacPhee. My ancestors come from Colonsay, Scotland, and Iona, and also Ireland. We have Tua migrations from Kahiki and Rapa Nui. And when we get in a little further into our talk, I'll share a little bit more about the migrational genealogy and the stars and the stones. But this is a topic I'm very passionate about, and I'm very thankful to be able to bring my ancestors forward to this platform and have a really dynamic conversation. So thank you for having me.
Yeah, you're welcome, and thanks to you as well for finding time for such an interesting topic.
Yeah, one of my favorites.
Yeah, we are going to talk about archaeoastronomy today. Mm-hmm. So let's get started. So if one has to understand it like a person who doesn't come from that background, mm-hmm. how would you explain it to someone? What is archaeoastronomy?
Yeah, well, archaeoastronomy in a very basic way of understanding is the relationship between the stars and the stones. Mm-hmm. And it's a very particular connection and alignment that comes in many different forms. Sometimes we see it in a pyramid, in a stone circle, in an old burrow or cairn. Usually they're associated, it's how we talk about sacred sites. Archaeoastronomy is really a Western Eurocentric construct to talk about sacred sites and what scientists assume they think they know about these places. What I've learned on my journey, I came into all of this being a very lucid dreamer and being absolutely love struck with the stars and the skies growing up, with the constellations, not knowing anything about it, but just having my heart pound every time I would look up in the sky and I could see a shape. I didn't know what it meant. And then in college, I took a class in Greek mythology and started learning a little bit about astrology. So when I was looking up, things started to make a little more sense. So then I also took, after high school, I took a class in astronomy. So it was kind of like my intuitive brain was just going in research directions that I was fascinated with. So Greek mythology and astrology and astronomy all started to kind of click together. And I thought, I don't really know what this means. But I also was very drawn when I would see images of sacred sites. So I was raised in a very conservative, Protestant, WASP household, but I had a dad who was very cool and very adamant about me seeing how the religions and the spiritual traditions are connected. I feel really blessed to have had a father who prompted me to think in this way. And years down the road, he said, I knew you had it in you. I just really wanted to do what I could to guide you to see how we are connected. So that really began my inquiry into what it means. And then when I was 25 years old, I was following my dreams, trying to find a graduate program where I could study spiritual traditions and dream work. And I ended up in a PhD program called Recovery of Indigenous Mind. And Recovery of Indigenous Mind is a track of graduate research studies for non-Native people who have been raised in a Western context, who want to recover our indigenous or tribal or ancestral ways of knowing. The other track that was parallel with my work was a traditional knowledge program. So students that were raised in tribal communities, on reservations, in tribal villages, could come into this Western academic program with non-Native people and obtain a PhD in their science, in their culture, in their ancestral ways of knowing. So the woman who started the program is Dr. Apila Colorado. She is Oneida and French and has a couple other genealogies. And when she was in graduate school, she coined the term Indigenous Science so that Native people could have a way to engage in conversations with other scientists. Because as you know, it's very evident that Western science is really focused on what it thinks it knows. And it's a very colonizing science. It has great benefit if it can open itself up and include the whole mind, or indigenous and Western ways of knowing in science. So Indigenous science allows us to have a conversation about things like archaeoastronomy and astrology and astronomy, but within a context that's not Eurocentric. It's a context that is indigenous. And what that allows is for all of us to have access to what archaeoastronomy really means. So it's not just about Native science or Indigenous science or archaeoastronomy being for just scientists or Native people. We all have this understanding and this way of knowing of what it means within us. We've just been, as you know, in a historical, traumatic, intergenerational process of colonization and genocide from all of the different tribes and clans that we come from. And we've perpetuated that cycle. So archaeoastronomy on some level perpetuates that cycle because it doesn't quite allow for spiritual science or Indigenous science to bridge. That's where Indigenous science can come in and help give us context and a language for what archaeoastronomy is trying to say. So archaeoastronomy is really the relationship between the stars and the stones. And what that means specific to each culture is unique, but there are certain threads that go across the board, like the mathematics that Indigenous people use to build a pyramid or align a stone circle. It doesn't matter if, you're looking at a pyramid in the Yucatan and a stone circle up, at Stonehenge. The same mathematics are being used to build that structure, and the same mathematics are being used to align these structures with specific star systems, and the same mathematics being used to align these things with the solstices and the equinoxes and so on. So my big head trip was like, well, how is this possible? If tribal people from all over the world do not speak the same languages, there's thousands of languages, but we're using the same exact mathematics to build our sacred sites and align them with the stars. I find it some people think, are we alone? Are there, UFOs? My greatest mystery is what do these things mean? What do the stones mean? What do the pyramids mean? What do they mean? So a lot of my early work was initiating the quest to figure out and find out what it means.
Why is it so important to the people and ancestors?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's so many reasons why. I think in the context of my own journey and my own ancestors, which I feel parallels Indigenous people and tribal people, is that it's so important because it shows us how It shows us our navigational route home. It shows us our map of how we got here, why we're here. It gives us our instructions. It tells us everything we need to know.
Does it serve as an interface?
Well, yeah, I mean, I when I go there, the way my brain works, I just say what's coming through. And when I was there, I feel like it's a big cosmic telephone home to our ancestors. It's what connects us to our ancestors. And when I say ancestors in an indigenous framework, I'm talking about humans. I'm talking about genealogies. I'm talking about plants. I'm talking about animals. I'm talking about the spiritual masters. I'm talking about all living things, because all living things have a genealogy. And all living things are connected. We are connected. So when I say it brings us home to our ancestors, it's like it's a really big statement, but I want to acknowledge that it's including our ancestors whose lineage we come from, and all living things, including the stars and the stones and the sun and the moon. All of these elements of archaeoastronomy or a stone circle and Indigenous science in Indigenous ways of knowing, it's all intelligent and alive. Thus, it's participating in research. So this is Indigenous science. All of nature is intelligent and alive, thus an active research participant. So when you go to a stone circle, yes, there's stones standing there. But in Indigenous culture, those stones are beings. They're not breathing oxygen like you and I, but if you can think of the standing stones in Rapa Nui with the heads, and they've now excavated them and they have full bodies. These stones are beings. They are intelligent. They are full of knowledge and science and information, just like the standing stones at Stonehenge. So when talking about it from an archaeoastronomy in an Indigenous framework, we're talking about something that has life and that we have relationship with. When talking about it from an archaeoastronomy point of view, we are observing stars and constellations and stones in alignment and place. So when my experience of archaeoastronomy was decolonized to a mindset that includes my Indigenous mind. So when I go to Stonehenge, I'm not just standing there with Stonehenge in the background taking a picture because, see, I went to Stonehenge. When I go to Stonehenge, I go sit with the stone. I meditate with the stone. I ask the stone what I need to know. What I need to know about this place or the alignment or the science of it. And so it's a much different way of approaching how do I know what I know versus just going in, making observations, recording that, and leaving. So archaeoastronomy is like a starting point to have a deeper conversation about star knowledge and Indigenous science. Because every single part of a structure, whether it's a pyramid or a stone circle, every single thing has meaning. The placement, the alignment, the mathematics, the energetics, the frequency, the alignment to the stars, the solstices and equinoxes. I mean, how did they know thousands of years ago in that place that stone placed in that spot, when the sun rose for the December 21st sunrise, how would they know that would exactly align with that stone that many millions of miles away from the sun, like without any technology? That fascinated me, and I wanted to know more about how they did it. And that's really what put me on this journey of archaeoastronomy.
Maybe they knew more than what we know now, or maybe they had a different perspective back then. So it's really cool. Very curious to know more about it.
Yeah, I mean, they didn't have, the Simpsons and the Kardashians to keep them distracted. They had survival. They had the need to, stay connected to what they were connected to. And I feel that the ability to be telepathic and the ability to be intuitive was highly fine-tuned, and we've lost that along the way. That's part of the colonization and sort of the perpetual cycle of intergenerational trauma, is that we've gotten further and further and further away from our indigenous ways of knowing. We all have ancestors. We all have tribes. We all have clans. We all have genealogy. But we've also, depending on who we are, we've had varying stories of very traumatic processes that have dissociated us from our indigenous science, specific to our ancestors. Yet, as we talked about before, I can go to a stone circle, or I can go to Newgrange Brunaboyne in Ireland, and I can sit there. And because my ancestors helped build these sites and migrated to this place, the knowledge of what it means is contained within me. It's just a matter of me doing the work on the inside to heal my intergenerational trauma, to decolonize, to learn my native language, to realign myself with the stars in the sky and what my ancestors called them and who those star beings are. It's like developing a relationship is what Indigenous science is about, or decolonizing a Western mind to recover the Indigenous ways specific to who we are is really through decolonization. But the stars and the stones have a relationship that is manifested in some of the carvings on the stones. And so that's really where the book of knowledge is located for my ancestors, is on those carvings, or some people call them petroglyphs, on those stones. That's the instruction manual of what it means. It's all there. Different locations have different connections to different star systems. Now, if I was to have this conversation in a room full of native elders who we can all agree to speak English, what I'm going to say is not a big deal and is already known. But for people who have not decolonized or been through the psychological process of decolonization, I could speak and people would think I was nuts or I was some new age Yahoo. Where I'm coming from is a place of deep decolonization and deep ways of knowing specific to my ancestors. So I just want to preface it with that. If you look at the pyramids of Giza and the alignment of what they're aligned with Orion's belt. There's the three pyramids, and there's this alignment with Orion's belt. Newgrange in Ireland is aligned with Sirius. There are heiaus in Hawaii aligned with Sirius. There are also sacred sites. Don't quote me on it, but I think it's Chichen Itza or Uxmal. One of those two in the Yucatan is aligned with the Pleiades. I think it's Chichen Itza. I'd have to go back to my notes. But depending on the tribal culture and the star system or systems that the genealogy and the stories connect us with, that will kind of determine what that site is aligned with. So it just depends on many factors. So in entering a decolonization program, I was asked to learn one of my native languages. So I learned the Awam script, which is the carvings and the markings on the stones. I saw that as a language, but a linguist did not see that as a language, and she wanted me to write the script in a sentence. So I drew her a three-dimensional map of how to communicate through encrypted code on the stones. So there's a language in those stones, but there's also a native language. So I learned Old Irish, and I also learned some Hawaiian through some Hawaiian chants and being part of a halau. So when recovering the language, then when you are sort of learning the words, really, I mean, it doesn't have to be fluent language. We also were learning our creation stories. How did we get here? I mean, most of us were, in my upbringing, were raised on Adam and Eve. And, that's only a small fraction of a much bigger picture. So I started with Ireland, and I learned about the Irish creation story and the four cities and Bridget and how the earth was created and how Ireland came to be. That is specific to this genealogy. My Hawaiian kupuna, he has a story of his creation story, and Credo Mutwa in Africa has his creation story. But when we sit together and we exchange our stories, there's common threads that connect us. And that's the beauty of exchanging knowledge between cultures, especially those of us that have been raised non-native, and we recover our indigenous ways of knowing, and then we can exchange knowledge with native elders. So in that exchange of knowledge, I asked a lot of questions. And a lot of it had to do with use of language and place names. And what I found is that each sacred site is aligned and connected to the star systems that each group of people is connected to and come from. So all across the world, if you brought a group of tribal people together representing their different cultures, the common story is the stars, and that we come from the stars, and there are specific star systems that we come from. So that things like UFOs and aliens, that's a whole other topic of conversation, but it's connected into archaeoastronomy. It relates back to star systems. So when I sat down with my kupuna and I started learning my native language, I found out about Tua, the Tua De Danann. And this is the redhead race. I'm redhead. So I was very interested to find that in Irish and in Hawaiian, there is this word Tua. So I went to my kupuna and I sat down with him and I said, hey, I've been studying language and I've noticed, this commonality between Irish and Hawaiian. Irish have little people, Hawaiians have little people. Like, there seems to be just a lot of parallels. And he just looked at me and he paused and he said, oh, Tua. So then he began to tell me about an 18 million year lineage and migrational navigation cycle from the star system of Sirius to what is commonly called New Zealand, migrated to Rapa Nui, migrated to Kahiki, Tahiti, and then migrated to Ireland. So from Sirius to New Zealand to Rapa Nui to Kahiki to Ireland. So then I said, well, I find it fascinating that the star system of Sirius is so prominent in all of this with this particular migration. So then I went back over to Ireland and connected with some of the elders in Ireland who are the stone keepers, and I found out that Newgrange is aligned with the star system of Sirius. So then I started backtracking to these different places and looking at the alignments of what stars and star systems these sacred sites are aligned with. And in my particular genealogical migration, it's the star system of Sirius. So then, in further talking with this Hawaiian chief, he began telling me about the different star systems and the different qualities of the different beings from the star systems and how different tribal communities on this planet are entrusted with the star knowledge specific to that system. There isn't one star system per tribe. Many tribes share these star systems in common. So a lot of it also comes through genealogy. So my ancestors are from the Seal clan. We are the Seal people. Makua is from Whale clan, the Whale people. And then there's others that come from Dolphin clan. And so what we have found is that those of us that have these connections or these relationships with these beings in our ancestry, that we also have a connection to the specific star system in common. What does that mean? What purpose does it have? That's a much bigger question. But for me to make the connection as an adopted, white woman from Oregon, having no connection to my ancestors other than dreams being relentless, I end up sitting on the edge of a crater with a Hawaiian spiritual warrior as chief, having a conversation about how we come from the same star system and how it's mapped out in the sacred sites on our ancestral land. So he would take us to heiaus and talk to us about what everything means, not so that we could be like an anthropologist and take that information and write it in a book and tell people what these people know. what he did, because we were in a decolonization program, is he told us what he knew and everything that he knew about his sacred sites, so that when we go home and I go to Ireland or I go to Scotland and I'm standing at a sacred site, I know what it means. The door has been opened. So my awareness, my understanding, my comprehension, when I go home to my own sacred sites, I have a better comprehension of what it means, and I can put the clues together quicker because I've been activated by a native elder who's told me what his means from his culture, because we're talking about the same mathematics. So he could tell me about the pi ratio and the golden mean being used to build the heiau, and I can take that exact mathematical science and apply it to Newgrange, Brunaboyne, or Stonehenge, and it means the exact same thing. And I find that enlightening and exciting, and I constantly want to know more about that.
I just wonder, was it because everything was based is actually based around the star system? Is it some kind of a collective consciousness which is, has been making people aware, about this pattern, that they have to follow or build? So there's a constant communication between different sites, I guess,
Well, yeah, I mean, I have this book, The Sun and the Serpent, and when I just started graduate school. I moved to Mount Shasta, and I went on a tour with Cheryl Yambach Rose. She's a visionary artist, and she took us to England to go on a tour with Hamish Miller, who has passed. He was a dowser. He's the most famous dowser. He would follow the energy lines, and Paul Broadhurst and Jeffrey Ash. And we would work with these elders, and we would walk on the landscape in England, and they would teach us about the male and female energy lines. There's a grid around the planet, and sacred sites are strategically and specifically aligned with what they would call like the acupuncture points of the planet. So sacred sites are kind of looked at as a portal. It's looked at as a communication device. It's also looked at as an acupuncture or acupressure point on the planet. And there's different sacred sites that are built and that are natural, that have been acknowledged by people from all over the world as very significant places where Indigenous science and sacred knowledge is contained. Now, it really depends on where somebody is at on their journey when they go to this place, what they're going to have access to. And I could go to the same site, and each time I can go deeper and deeper and deeper. It just depends on where I'm at when I'm there. I was at Stonehenge when I was 19. I was studying at University of London on an exchange program, and I went with a group of students on a tour bus. We went and took our picture in front of Stonehenge. We went to the gift shop, and we got on the bus, and we went somewhere else. That was one level. My excitement to actually be in front of Stonehenge was all I could take. But then 6 years later, I went back on a research trip. I went with Cheryl. She introduced us to Philip Cargolm, who is still chief druid. He brought us into Stonehenge. We sat on the center stone. We meditated with all the stones in the circle. And then I intuitively said, where do I need to go? And I walked around all of the stones, and I ended up sitting at the heel stone outside of the stone circle, because I just felt that's where the energy would come into the stone circle through the heel stone. The heel stone was the anchor for what's going on in the stone circle. So that's where I would sit, and I would meditate and pray and ask to know what I needed to know. And I would ask for permission to be there. That was what Humbotsman, a Mayan elder, taught me when I went to Chichen Itza. The very first program tour that I went on was in the Yucatan with all the native students, and I specifically remember going up to Chichen Itza and him stopping us and putting our things down, and he turned to the pyramid and he prayed and he asked permission to enter the knowledge of the place. And from that day on, every single time I go into a forest, I go into a stone circle, I go into a pyramid, I ask for permission to be there. And I leave an offering specific to my ancestors. And I carry, I don't have it in front of me, but I carry a little offering bag. I've taught my kids to carry an offering bag. It's a way of being respectful to the place. It's a way of being respectful to the tribe and the clan and the keepers, the gatekeepers of these places. And so I learned to do that. And in learning to do that, when I would go into a place like Stonehenge, I could get mass amounts of visuals. I would draw, I would write things down, I would sketch, I would just get as much as I could from my visual memory into a journal so that I could then go back and transcribe what that visit at that moment in time at that sacred site meant. And then after so many years of going back to the same sacred sites, I've developed a relationship with that sacred site. And I don't have to go to the sacred site to visualize it, to tap into it and access it. It's within me all the time because we're hooked up on a electrical grid around the planet. I mean, it's basic science. There's electromagnetic fields all over the planet. Well, these sacred sites, they've also found have energy lines. In England, they call it the Michael line, the Mary line. The Dragon line. There's different energetic lines that cross. And these crossing points are typically where a sacred site is placed. Well, because of cycles of colonization and genocide, you'll often see sacred sites covered over with a nice steeple or a church because the builders of the church knew to align their sanctuary on the sacred site lines. So they would put the altar at the front of the church at the place where the Michael and the Mary line cross. So part of archaeoastronomy or Indigenous science is peeling back that information. It's important to know that when I went into the Salisbury Cathedral, everything that was going on with that church, but then I wanted to go deeper and I wanted to know the Indigenous science underneath that church. What is it built upon? So one of the best examples is the Glastonbury Tor. The Tor is a really old ancient mound that is at the base of it is Chalice Well. And on the very top of the mound, the classic picture is a big steeple. And to me, it's just a sign of sort of the colonization of the tribal knowledge or the Indigenous science of place. One of the stories that everybody knows is on, March 17th, we celebrate St. Patrick's Day. And St. Patrick, in my understanding, is, a colonizer. He drove out the snakes in Ireland. Well, in Ireland, there are no snakes. There's no snakes. It's not a creature that exists in Ireland. But St. Patrick, we're told, drove the snakes out. Well, what did he drive out? He drove out the tribal knowledge. My ancestors were shape-shifting seal people. I'm sure we looked like a snake when he saw us. So a lot of the Indigenous knowledge was colonized and really genocided out of culture through taking out language. One of the main tools that are still used on Native people happened in Ireland. They wouldn't allow us to speak Irish. We had to speak English. Well, when you take away language from an Indigenous population, you take away their culture. You take away the knowledge. You take away the science. You take away the relationship Indigenous people have with all living things. Because those names, those place names, those stories that are transmitted in the original language is where the knowledge is contained. So in the last few years, there was a knowledge keeper, Jake Thomas. He's Haudenosaunee, and he was the last speaker of the Great Law of Peace. And it took him 9 days to recite the Great Law of Peace. And the Great Law of Peace is what our Constitution was. Our Constitution kind of appropriated some of the Great Law of Peace to create the Constitution. Well, when Jake Thomas died, there's nobody that can recite the Great Law of Peace. There's bits and pieces, and I'm sure there's a recording, but somebody to actually articulate that language when somebody has died or the culture hasn't been allowed to speak it. Then we go back to the sacred site and we're like, well, what does it mean? But we're trying to figure it out in English what it means. And it doesn't work. You can only go so far in English to figure out what a sacred site means, or a stone with a carving in it, what that means. So when you enter these places, you have to enter it with a completely different framework or state of mind to gain access to what it means.
Wow, that's a lot of information. So yeah.
It is, because I mean, see, that's the thing. Like you go to a sacred site, and like I go there and I'm receptive, I'm open, and even a native elder just telling us what the site means, it's like an encyclopedia every time somebody talks about it, because there's so much. We're talking about 18 million years of knowledge, so that's why reducing it to speaking in English is challenging, but it also allows us to talk about it when we don't speak the same languages. So that's sort of the antipode, or the prescription of it all is, yes, we're still using English to talk about it, but we're also using English to remember what it's about.
If I have to go with some example, just thinking as a human from the current time, 21st century, and not coming from that background, if I have to translate some carving from the stone, and if I have to imagine how would it look like, would it have some kind of a structure or a drawing or some kind of sign? What would it mean? Like, could it be based on different interpretations that different people have, or is it like very specific, which is already decoded? I guess not, but maybe if you can throw some light.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like it's both. I feel like it's both. So the best example that I have is Newgrange in Ireland. It's also called Brunaboyne. And my personal experience was going to Ireland and synchronistically meeting people that were cairn keepers, or people that take care of the stones or take care of the landscape around the sacred sites. And so when I first got started, I would hear their experience and their stories of what it means. And then I came across a book called The Stars and the Stones by Martin Brennan. It is the definitive book in Ireland on archaeoastronomy. It was like really the first book that was written about what the stones mean from his Irish perspective. So he comes from there, and he's also remembering what it means and what has been passed down to him. So that was my first step into what does Brunaboyne mean. Then there was my personal experience. So when I looked at an image up above of the cairn, first of all, it's encapsulated in quartz crystal. So there's a quartz crystal element to it. When they excavated it, they found quartz crystal. So if you were to take the top off of this cairn and you were to look down, there's a passageway. And when you go because you can go into the cairn, when you go into the cairn, you're going down a passageway, kind of like a long little hall, and you get to a certain point and you stop. When you're looking down at a map at what that is, what's inside of that cairn is a cross. So how did our ancestors know in 3000 BC about the cross? How did they know about a cross? That was my first question. How do they know about a cross? Because that cross came way before Christianity. So the inside of the cairn is in the shape of a cross. So if you go into the cairn, you walk to the back, there's two little side wings on the side and then one on the top. Well, at the sort of the head of the cross is what is called, for lack of a better word, the triple spiral. There's a spiral there that is seen all over the world. It's a very well-known spiral. I even have the spiral on my business page. It's on my business card. So on December 21st, at Newgrange, there's a little box above the doorway to go in. And when the sun comes above the sunrise, it enters this little tiny box. Number one, how did they figure out how to align it with the sun on that day? Why that day? It goes into the box, and in 17 minutes, the sun crawls up the cairn to that head of the cross. It illuminates the triple spiral, and then it pulls back out. I'm like, that's deep. Like, that's so deep. So I went into that cairn on a tour. I situated myself right next to the spiral. I put my hand back and I put my hand on the spiral. And I sat there and I just didn't even, I asked permission before I went in. But when I put my hand on that spiral, I didn't say a word. I was so humbled to be in that place, touching that stone with that spiral. I just decided to stay receptive on what my ancestors in this place wanted me to know. And then I went back out and I started just writing down everything that I could. And then when I went further into my graduate work and I looked at that spiral, it taught me every single thing I needed to know about how to decolonize, about how to initiate decolonization for my Western mind, how to take the journey from my Western mind to my Indigenous mind. So this spiral is spiraling. It's a Western mind stuck in a wheel. It's not going anywhere. But if I get on the decolonization train and I go across the bridge, there's another spiral. So now there's two spirals, and they're spiraling because my Western mind is activated, but then there's movement. There's a movement over to my Indigenous mind. So now there's movement between my Indigenous and my Western. So now there's movement. The Western mind isn't stuck. It's actually moving. So now it's moving. Decolonization has been activated. Now there's movement. Well, what happens when this mind of Western and this mind of Indigenous is moving and they're moving together? Well, what happens is a third spiral emerges. And the third spiral is that indication that the mind is beginning to be in a place of balance, where it can navigate between knowing when it's in its Western mind and when it's in its Indigenous mind. And so when this awareness happens, that third spiral is the observer of one's own duality of Western and Indigenous. So there's movement between all the three spirals now. Not only am I balancing my Western mind and my Indigenous mind, but I'm observing that happening. I'm aware of it and I'm observing it and I'm participating in it. So from my experience, I have a very deep and profound relationship and connection to White Tara in Tibetan Buddhism. I have deep and profound connections to different spiritual practices from different cultures, but always very aware that this is not my culture, and I want to respect that. So I've had some training in self-awareness practice. I've had some training in meditation practice to observe my own duality. But this spiral, when I put my hand on it and I went to it and I activated it, it allowed me to fully engage in the observation of my own self-awareness and my own duality. Now, that doesn't mean it's all the time. I'm a human. I get distracted. Things happen. But what I'm very aware of is when my Indigenous mind and my Western mind are communicating, when they're not communicating. Sometimes I feel like shutting one or the other off. But where it comes back to is that stone with that carving aligned with that sacred site and that solstice gave me the information I needed to get my cellular memory to a place of healing and self-awareness and observation. So I am the triple spiral. When you interact with me, you're interacting with the triple spiral. You're interacting with the knowledge of Bruna Boyne because my ancestors built the sacred site. It's in my genealogy and it's in my lineage. So for me, it's very personal what it means to me. Now I can go back and read Martin Brennan's book. There's a lot of the carvings and there's a lot of meaning in the stones. And in lieu of like trying to take all of it on and figure it all out, I just took one small piece, which is this particular sacred site, this particular stone, and this particular structure is where I've concentrated a lot of my attention. Now, when I take my experience and I go to other sacred sites in other places, I have a better understanding of how they're connected. I can see the spirals from a different point of view. The spirals in other cultures speak to me. So when I was talking about that genealogical lineage from Sirius to New Zealand to Rapa Nui and so on, if you look at some of the artwork in that migration, you can see the artwork and how it is all connected and has a common thread or aesthetic between this tribal migration and this culture. So for me, my sort of draw is into spirals and, triple spirals and things that move. Some people focus on the creation stories that are encased in the stones. There's so much. I mean, I've only barely talked about a fraction of one spot and one stone and one carving. There's volumes at Newgrange and then multiple sacred sites all over Ireland with volumes of carvings and stones, let alone the standing stones that have the Aum script written into it. I mean, I've been doing this work for 30 years and I'm still feeling like I'm just on the edge of understanding what it all means. And maybe I'm not meant to. Maybe I'm just supposed to have this one piece of understanding around Newgrange and the triple spiral and decolonization. This is my piece. But there's volumes. I could go to Ireland and study it for the rest of my life and still not study all of it.
Yeah, but you're still exposed to one piece of it, which already means a lot. I think you always start small.
Yeah. Yeah.
But so you talked also about the energy lines and the electromagnetism. So there's definitely a mention of physics.
Well, and it's mapped out. I mean, Hamish Miller was a blacksmith. He lived in Cornwall, and he's been on television. He's the most famous dowser. He uses dowsing rods, and he uses dowsing rods that he blacksmithed to map out the energy lines, the Michael lines, the Mary. I mean, these were the guys that made the maps of the lines around the land that they live. And so his book, The Sun and the Serpent, there are actual, I mean, they would take us to these sites, but they actually have examples of where the lines run and then what sacred sites are aligned on this line. And then if you have a line that crosses with another line, there's going to be another particular sacred site with its own set of instructions. I mean, I really look at archaeoastronomy and Indigenous science as an instruction manual. And it just depends on where we're at. This is a great example of Indigenous epistemology. I mean, so in this picture, I'll send this to you. We've got psychology, architecture, art, agriculture, mathematics, metaphysics, creation cycles, mythology. I mean, Western mind is what separates everything into separate topics. So when we go to college, we have to pick a major. Psychology over here, science over here, math over here. In Indigenous science, we don't do that. It's all connected. It's all connected. We don't separate out the sciences because they have their own departments. It's all connected. We can't understand math without science. We can't understand plant medicine alchemy without science, without math. It's all connected. So when we're talking about Indigenous science, we can shift from math to science to art to mythology to plant nutrition in one conversation because it's all connected. But if we're using our Western mind, which is also our colonized mind to talk about it, we're only going to talk about psychology and probably only talk about Jungian psychology. It's going to get very specific and isolate the topic, where in Indigenous science, we're talking about the relationship of science to math, math to art, art to physics. It's how we view the relationship of what we're talking about. So the framework in an Indigenous framework is, like I showed you, it's more of a wheel. It's more of a circle of connection. In Western mind, it's usually linear and there's points and they're separate. So part of the decolonization process is using an Indigenous mindset that we all have to understand what we're talking about.
That makes so much sense. And I would like to just share something from my own experience. So when I was studying at the school, it was so hard for me in the initial years to catch up with a lot of subjects. I always used to complain that why are they not interconnected? Because and I think I find some answers out of this conversation, the way you explained just in your last explanation.
Good.
It makes so much sense to me, because I always keep saying without any reference, without really having a concrete base to support. Like, I get into a lot of conversation with different friends of mine, colleagues, that these things should be interconnected.
Well, they already are. They already are interconnected. We've just been colonized, and colonization means separation from
Yeah.
our indigenous ways of knowing, from our indigenous language, from our indigenous knowledge. So colonization has separated us from, it's separated us so much that we make fun of people that talk this way. And so I might have done all of this work for the last 30 years, but sometimes when I go to a public meeting and I say something, people think I'm a wingnut coming out of like a new age castle, and I'm not. And I'm not there. I'm not here to prove anything to anybody whatsoever. That is not my journey. My journey is to use the skills that my ancestors have given me and to find my passions in sharing these gifts to the people that I serve. And I would wish this for everybody.
So this was the end of part 1 for this episode. For part 2, please click the link on the side if you're on YouTube, or please check out the list if you're on any other platform such as Spotify or Google Podcast.